Well, hello, everyone. My name is Ernest Dollar, and I'm excited to be with you today and to talk about my new book that's coming out in April of 2022 called Hearts Torn Asunder, Trauma in the Civil War's Final Campaign in North Carolina. This book is sort of a synthesis of about 20 years of research in the last campaign in North Carolina and trying to understand not only the mindset of soldiers and civilians during this last days of the Civil War, but also how that experience shaped the memory of the end of the Civil War in North Carolina. So I kind of wanted to start today's talk by looking at how it was remembered. So in October of 1923, there was a monument erected at the site of the surrender of Joseph Eggleston Johnston, the Confederate commander, to William Tecumseh Sherman. The monument you see pictured in the background of this image was a fairly contested experience. When the erection of this monument that featured two columns of granite, one representing the North and one the South, and a pediment across the top inscribed with the word unity, was promoted by Durham business leaders in North Carolina. The city had grown up after the Civil War, and its fame in the tobacco market was largely due to the interest in tobacco by Union soldiers who camped around the area during the surrender negotiations. The Durham business leaders thought that this monument would be such a great way to attract tourists to the growing town. But there were a lot of folks who did not want to see this monument erected. When it was put forth to the Durham community, both the local United Daughters of the Confederacy, UCV, the United Confederates Veterans Camp, were in arms and greatly disliked the idea of putting up a monument to the surrender of what they called one of Lee's army. They feared that this monument would open old wounds that were made in the last days of the war as it ground to a halt here in Durham. So there was a great public discussion on should this be a place and an experience to be remembered. Very few former Union soldiers, if any, participated in this experience of raising this monument. So among the great debates comes one question about what wounds would this monument remind the local citizens of? And as we take a look at the last days of the Civil War in the East, Sherman's campaign, the last major campaign of the Civil War, launches a day after Appomattox Courthouse. So on April 10th, 1865, over 120,000 Union and Confederate soldiers began to march across central North Carolina. Sherman's army by this time had numbered about 89,000 soldiers and was resupplied, reorganized, after an incredibly contentious and devastating march through South Carolina and lower North Carolina, a continuation of his march to the sea. Opposing him were what was remained of the reformed Army of the Tennessee by Joseph Eggleston Johnston. These men had arrived in North Carolina after their defeats at Franklin and Nashville in early 1865. And Johnston pulled together what forces he could to try to stop Sherman at the Battle of Bentonville in March of 1865, but was wholly unsuccessful. So now Sherman began to move west to try to attack Johnston's army. He had learned that Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and his army was no longer needed to help Grant to break the siege at Petersburg. So the new objective of the Union Army was to crush the last remaining Confederate army east of the Mississippi, and that of the Army of Tennessee. Now, by the time these soldiers had arrived in North Carolina, they had seen an incredibly difficult war. These men, many of them had been fighting since 1861 and had really suffered a great deal of stress from all of these major battles that they had been through. Many of Sherman's men had served in the Eastern Theater and been in such places as Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. And most of Sherman's force, 80% of them were veterans. So these men were the cream of the crop for the Union Army under his command. But again, they had suffered greatly in their campaign. So what we want to talk about today is how these men and women expressed their emotions. How can we tell how war was affecting them, and to what degree, and to what depths that it caused problems for them, with psychological, emotional, physical problems? And by taking just a quick glance at this final campaign, we began to see just how much of an impact that war had on these people. And what we see that this war does not end for them in 1865 with the surrender had been in place, but it follows them through the rest of their lives, and in many cases claims them as the reason for their deaths. And I kind of wanted to start today by talking about the first couple of pages of the book, and it really brings to the surface how the impact of war stress affects soldiers, how civilians saw that, and how they crafted a memory of this fairly contentious and dramatically devastating last days of the war. Cornelia Phillips Spencer was the wife of a university professor in Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina. And she had a front row seat to watch the war end not only in her town, but she had very affluent neighbors who told her of their experiences as the war ground down. Now, one of her neighbors was a former governor, David L. Swain. And Governor Swain had rushed to Raleigh in the days before it fell to Union authorities in early April of 1865. Swain and another former governor, William Graham, pitched an idea to the then governor, Zebulon Vance, to somehow surrender the Confederacy. So they rode out into the middle of the skirmishing armies, begged for quarter, and received Sherman's promise that he would protect North Carolina's capital city of Raleigh. On April 13th, the governors returned and stood poised to turn over the city to the advancing federal army. As they were getting ready to return to the city, they were stopped by General Sherman's cavalry commander, Judson Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick, who had a great distrust of Southerners, approached the men and gave them this ultimatum. He said, "I know of Sherman's offer to spare the city, but if I meet any resistance, there'll be hell to pay." So the governors raced back into the city on that cold, rainy April 13th morning and hopefully awaited an easy turnover to the Union authorities. As Swain dashes through the deserted streets to the state capitol, is waiting on the stairs, he begins to see something happening, something devastating, something that was going to break this very fragile truce that he had forged with Sherman. And he noticed a group of Confederate cavalrymen riding up, hitching their horses, and then starting to loot jewelry stores here in Raleigh. Swain knew that this could really violate the truce, so he marches over to these men and said, "Hey, you guys must leave. You're going to violate the truce for the surrender of Raleigh." The Confederate troopers kind of brush him off, explain to Swain that damn the town and damn Sherman too, they cared for neither. And so a shouting match erupts, and it's only broken by the sounds of the band of Union Army band playing Hail Columbia as Kilpatrick's parade begins to march up one of the city's main streets. Inexplicably, the men dash away and head out to join the other Confederate camps on the outside of town. But one lone Confederate cavalryman gets on his horse and waits at the head of the street. And as Kilpatrick starts to ride up the street with his band playing in this procession to capture another Confederate capital, the lone trooper pulls out his pistol and begins firing at the advanced party, screaming, "Hurrah for the Southern Confederacy." He puts his pistol back in his holster, whips his horse around, and dashes out of town. But sadly, his route out of town didn't go out of town. And he has to make a quick turn to make it over to the bridge across the railroad that surrounds Raleigh. Well, the wet cobblestones and the horse's hooves didn't match, and his horse slips and falls, throwing the rider to the ground. But before this Confederate can mount his horse, he's grabbed by Kilpatrick's Union staff officers and dragged back to the Capitol grounds where Kilpatrick is waiting. Now, Cornelia Phillips Spencer writes in her book, The Last 90 Days of the War, which was one of the very first histories of the end of the war in North Carolina, what happens next. She says the lone trooper was brought before and enraged Kilpatrick. And Kilpatrick asked the young trooper, "Why did you violate the truce?" And in her version, the young trooper says, "I didn't know of any truce." Kilpatrick turns to his staff officers and said, "Take this man out where none of the ladies can see him and hang him." Spencer writes, the young man begs for 5 minutes to right his wife, which was cruelly denied, and he was carted off and hung. This is his headstone you see here on the slide of Lieutenant William Walsh. Now, there was another eyewitness who witnessed this entire scene, and this is Millie Henry, you see on the right. She was an enslaved woman who had been brought from Yazoo, Mississippi back to Raleigh by her masters, and she was drawing well on the Capitol grounds that morning and saw the entire incident. She remembers the trooper firing and dashing off and being brought before Kilpatrick, but in her version is a drastically different than Spencer's version. In Henry's version, the young trooper is asked his name. He said, "I'm Robert Walsh of the 11th Texas Cavalry." Kilpatrick asked him, "Why did you violate the truce?" And in Millie Henry's version, the trooper says, "Because I hate the Yankees and wish they were dead in a pile." Patrick turns to his staff officers, "Take this man out where none of the ladies can see him and hang him." But again, Henry's version differs greatly than Spencer's version. And Millie Henry says after this young trooper was condemned, he starts laughing maniacally and saying, "Thank you, sir, thank you." And she said he laughed all the way to the gallows before he was hung. So that reaction is an incredibly strange reaction for this young trooper who, him and the rest of the 11th Texas Cavalry had been in the saddle for over a year and had fought Sherman and opposed them all the way across Georgia through the Carolinas. So they had been in combat for an extended period of time. So if we look at the behavior of Walsh and sort of the other Confederates that we see in these last days, that we really believe that war has worn them down. Now, these are cavalrymen of the 8th Texas Cavalry who were there with Johnston at the very end. And the comment by Walsh about wanting to find the Yankees dead in a pile, well, what enraged Kilpatrick the most is that he had been finding his men dead in piles, largely at the hands of Johnston's Texas cavalrymen. By the time they had reached Carolina, a lot of these Texas cavalrymen would execute Union prisoners they captured. They would dismember them, they would cut their throats, and at times they would hang placards around their necks saying "Death to foragers." So war by this time had become incredibly grisly, with no prisoners taken on either side. And it really begins to show not only how their mental capacity to wage war, but how war had affected their judgment so much that they could do this to prisoners they captured. Now, the inset picture is another one of Terry's Texas Rangers, John W. Rabb. And John W. Rabb was a case where he was a killer. Soldiers remember that he had over 60 notches in his pistol for all those he had slain. But Rabb, he was affected by war. So much so, later in life, that he really suffered with mental health to the point where he actually ended up killing himself in the 1880s. So as we look at the Confederates, and we'll look at the Union soldiers as well, they expressed so much stress from the war, and this stress had affected their morals to a great degree, which made this war in Carolina, this last campaign, one of the ugliest, and one that many people really wanted to forget. Now, when we talk about war affecting men, it is almost as old as war itself. As we look back in time, even to the ancient period, we see a lot of soldiers being affected with inexplicable problems from the battlefield. We see soldiers inexplicably going blind in the Trojan War. We see some of the very earliest texts of the ancient world where men would dream of those they had slain on the battlefield and talked about talking to their ghost. So if we really look back in history, we do see instances of how war affected people. And this slide here begins to talk about from the Civil War on up to our conflicts today, there's a desperate need to put a title, so somehow to classify what's going on with soldiers from combat. So we see the conflicts on the left and sort of the terms that are used during this time period to kind of to put a diagnosis to what these soldiers are suffering from. And I think it's important, we'll talk about this later, the age of a lot of these men who are fighting is going to be important to see how susceptible they are to having long-term trauma damage as they go through their military experience. So it's not until the 1980s, after Vietnam, do we begin to see the term post-traumatic stress disorder used of these stress injuries. And again, doctors will struggle to try to understand not only the mind, but to put a term to what they see in their patients. Now, when we talk about that struggle to diagnose, we look back the Civil War. As the war begins to ramp up, Union casualties began to pour into hospitals. Doctors began to recognize a strange cardiovascular problem in soldiers, that there's this heart problem that they cannot find a cause for. And these are two Union Army surgeons who really began to study this phenomenon and try to understand what's going on with this this disorder that they can't understand. Jacob Decosta was one who had worked in hospitals outside of Washington, D.C. And he begins to really look at this cardiovascular problems and puts the term to it as soldier's heart. And they began to look at it as an overstress on the body. Perhaps it's too much equipment. Perhaps it is too much stress of physical activity in the field. Another counterpart of Decosta is Isaac Stearns, and he begins to look at what British doctors are diagnosing in the veterans of the Crimea War of the 1850s. And he begins to look at how they are starting to look at a different diagnosis by looking through a nervous. They believe that there's a nervous component, that the nervous system is being affected. And so he coins the term that is sort of utilized by a lot of British doctors of postbellum neurokinesis. This is sort of your forerunner of PTSD for Civil War doctors. So this is a term that they began to try to throw at these series of disorders that they just cannot figure out what's going on with their men. And then as we begin to look at what trauma these men went through, it is grotesque. And when we talk about trauma in our lives, trauma that would cause problems, we usually talk about car wrecks, sexual violence, some type of a natural disaster, some event where people are truly, that they feel like their lives are threatened. And this is sort of the real cornerstone of a post-traumatic stress disorder, is fear, this fear. And again, when we look at Civil War battlefields, we've been sort of desensitized to a lot of the Brady photos, but then you have images like this from Adolf Metzner from the Battle of Shiloh, which is just as grotesque as any Civil War battlefield photograph could be. And it just shows these two Confederates who are playing cards, and a cannonball came by and just literally took their heads off. So this is the kind of trauma we need to be reminded ourselves of these men experienced for years. And at many times throughout the years that these men from the battlefield found themselves feeling of such great danger that it just caused deep wounds, psychological wounds for them. So to break away from history a little second, we need to understand a little bit about science and how the brain works and how it's basically built. So the two parts of the brain we want to talk about are the primitive brain and the frontal lobe. So the primitive brain is this sort of red area, this fear and flight section. And this part of the brain controls everything from breathing, digestion, cardiovascular, everything that we do that we really don't think about that keeps us alive. And this is the area that we really draw on whenever we feel in danger, this fight or flight or freeze reaction. Like, do we want to run? Are we prepared to fight for our lives? Or do we just become immobile, frozen in fear? So this is the part of the brain that controls how the body works. Now, the frontal lobe is where we develop thought and judgment, and emotions are kept. So if we talk about most of our advanced thought comes from this frontal lobe. But this incredible, strange thing happens when we encounter fear. The front of the brain shuts off, and all of the energy is shifted back to this middle of the brain, this primal brain, because in an instant, the brain releases these neurochemical cocktails that forces the body to get ready to fight, to flee. So your heart rate gets faster, time slows down, you begin to focus, your breathing increases. So this is your body's response to amp itself up to deal with whatever threat it is. So what happens though is the front of the brain with your judgment is impaired because all of the energy of the brain is shifting to the middle. So this is how we begin to think about how PTSD affects morality on the battlefield. How could soldiers do that? Or how could they, do this cruel act? Because basically this judgment switch has been thrown. Now, when we look at sort of the symptoms of stress disorder, here are sort of the ones that we break down in sort of three categories. When they re-experience the traumatic event that kind of gave them the shock or the trauma in the first place, we often find that people do not want to be reminded, or they avoid either the places or the stimulus or anything that reminds them of this trauma-causing event. And then we see hyperarousal, that their minds, their bodies, in particular their brains, are stuck in this fight or flight mode. The switch that kind of switches the brain back to the frontal lobe is always turned on. So we see that they are kind of always keyed up to combat any perceived threat. So it's like they're a lot of agitated, angry outbursts. They can't fall asleep. So the brain is truly stuck in this mode to deal with stress. And this is sort of our modern diagnosis of what we see in soldiers coming back from combat today. And most of the medical field has acknowledged these diagnoses and has applied them to understanding the diagnosis of soldiers today. But as we look back at the historical record for the end of the war in North Carolina, we see both men and women, soldiers and civilian, demonstrating a lot of these same diagnoses, not only in how they say they feel, but how they act. And it's impossible for us to diagnose these people of 150 years ago, but truly by what they say and do really begins to inform us that they are suffering some long-term trauma problems from this experience. Now, in the past, trying to diagnose PTSD was a guessing game. And there's a lot of dubious people who did not think that this was a truly unseen wound of war. But the advance in technology and the studies of soldiers coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, and the advancements of science has given us some incredibly powerful tools that we can literally see the effect of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury in we can see those wounds in the minds of veterans. And this slide just kind of shows you about how the brain changes due to the impact of these neurochemicals, which just inundate and saturate the brain and become so toxic. Because whenever the brain reacts to trauma, everybody does this and releases these chemicals, but after a while, the brain flushes them away. But again, if we look at the repeated trauma these people encountered and experienced, if you think about all the battles over and over, and especially for these men of Sherman and Johnston's commands, the reoccurring trauma they suffer through all of these battles, and to be on campaign for almost a year straight without a rest, this is what really begins to set up this model for the trauma that a lot of these soldiers are experiencing and demonstrating in the war's final days. So we wanted to talk about a couple of instances of these soldiers who really do demonstrate long-term trauma, who were here with Sherman and Johnston, and talk about how it shaped how they fought the war and how it shaped the rest of their lives. And we want to talk about Colonel Newell Gleeson, who was the colonel of the 87th Indiana. Gleeson and the men of his regiment really saved the Union Army at the Battle of Chickamauga. They were the ones that stood fast on Snodgrass Hill and really bought time to save the Union Army. Not only did Gleeson win accolades for his defense and saving the army, but it also really deeply affected his mind. And over the next year, as Sherman against a campaign through North Georgia and across the sea, Gleeson is with him. But his men begin to notice that the general's mental facilities are breaking down. They talk about seeing him sitting on a log by the campfire, laughing hilariously at nothing at one time, and then the next minute sobbing and crying the next. He would pull staff officers aside and tell them of he knows of the plot to remove him from command. He just knows it's there. And most telling, as his men enter South Carolina, which most of the Union soldiers really hated because of they believed that the treason of the war itself began in South Carolina. Gleeson yells out to his men not to leave any living thing alive, which surprises men who saw him as generally a strict disciplinarian. So after the war, Gleeson he battles with his mental illness and his dilapidated state until one day he throws himself down his stairs and kills himself in the 1880s. And we see that a lot of these soldiers with these commands cannot escape. They can sometimes put off the war at bay, but we see a lot of the memories and this mental trauma really claims them in the end. Now, we talked about just how post-traumatic stress disorder and the brain affects morality, the judgment. And especially in these last days, as Sherman is making his way across South Carolina, there begins an incredible tit-for-tat executions where the Union authorities are sick of finding their foragers executed by the Texans we talked about earlier and other soldiers of Johnson's cavalry. So the Union authorities threatened and in some cases carried out executing Confederate soldiers to sort of say that, if you can kill prisoners, we can kill them too. So it is truly a dark chapter in the Civil War. And unfortunately, this fellow, John A. Cundiff, was on one of these execution squads where he was forced to execute a older Confederate soldier who had been captured, the father of kids, and putting a bullet into this poor Confederate prisoner really affected Cundiff for the rest of his life. After the war, he goes home to Indiana and is just haunted by the memories of what he did. And, friends and family say that, he would constantly complain of the Confederates who were out to get him and constantly skulking around his cabin and would take his blanket and musket and sleep in the woods for days. And this was a story that was repeated for families, that their veterans and their families just couldn't escape to those ghosts from the war that they brought home with them. Now, this is Daniel M. Stearns, and if you've heard of Daniel M. Stearns, you've probably heard of Harvey first. For those folks who enjoy talking about Civil War dogs, Harvey is one of the most famous. And he was the mascot for the 104th Ohio. And Stearns put a collar on Harvey saying, I am Lieutenant Daniel M. Stearns' dog. Whose dog are you? That's a funny soldier joke. And Stearns had carried Harvey throughout the war. And we see Daniel M. Stearns, again, suffering from his service. He had really came down with a heat stroke while fighting outside of Atlanta in 1864. Had high fever and really being in the saddle for 2 days straight deeply affected him. And we see a lot of Civil War doctors who can't really label these issues that soldiers are happening, and so they just go with their next closest thing, which is sunstroke. So we see a lot of misdiagnoses of men who are suffering from heat stroke, which is really just mental breakdown. And as Stearns and his men are traveling through North Carolina, Harvey is there with him. And as they march back home, Stearns returns to Ohio, and he's a broken man. He's unable to concentrate, unable to keep a job. He complains of these incredible headaches that he's having, and he more increasingly prefers the company of Harvey, and almost as what we would call today a support animal, that him and Harvey become inseparable. And it's only when Stearns' family put him into an asylum that Harvey and his dog are separated. Stearns eventually dies in the Ohio Asylum, and Harvey goes on to attend many of the regimental reunions. So another sad case where soldiers are just deeply affected by that combat experience. Now, strangely, this is a puzzling case, and this is the story of George W. Wettstein, who was the 20th Corps of the 33rd Indiana. Wettstein had avoided the war on up into 1864. He had just had a third child and was drafted, and was incredibly upset about being sucked into this war. Trains in late 1864, is sent to join Sherman's army outside of Goldsboro, and arrives on April 9th, a day before the army moves out. And as part of his first campaign, he slogs along with the rest of the unit toward Raleigh and arrives here on April 13th. But on the morning of April 24th, all of Wettstein's messmates can't find him. They knew that the previous night he had complained of having an incredible headache and was really bitter about his military service, but him and his fellow soldiers didn't think much of it. So when they left roll call to find Wettstein, they went back to his tent and they found him there. But it seems at some point during the night that Wettstein had taken off his suspenders, made a loop running the length of the suspenders through the buttonhole, put his head in the loop, and strangled himself. So he killed himself on the grounds of the North Carolina Insane Asylum without really much of a note or telling us why he did what he did, but it's just a mystery. And so he is still here in Raleigh and rests in the Raleigh National Cemetery. And again, this is where the 20th Corps with Wettstein camped during the occupation of Raleigh. The North Carolina Insane Asylum opened its doors in 1856 after the campaigning of Dorothea Dix, who had been served as the war as one of the superintendent of nurses. But before the war, she had campaigned all across the United States to find places for those mentally troubled people who could find adequate help. A lot of times those who were deemed insane were thrown in prisons or jails or locked in basements and were truly treated pretty badly. And so Dorothea Dix had campaigned to have states to build asylums where these people could be properly treated and hopefully cured. She came to Raleigh in 1848, and resulting in this hospital being built, opening it in 1856. And in fact, the first patient to arrive here at the hospital was a veteran of the Mexican War, who sought treatment here for sunstroke. Now, during the war, the hospital stayed open, and you began to see a flood of Confederates being sent back to North Carolina from the fronts in Virginia, suffering with mental issues. And again, we began to see the civilian populace begin to fill up the hospital during this war period as well. Now, it's going to be, the hospital is going to be overwhelmed in the coming years after the war. And one of those who arrived is this fellow here. His name is Aristarchus Jenkins, who was with the 15th North Carolina. In examining Jenkins' war record, it's pretty rough. He goes off with the 15th North Carolina to fight in early battles of the war with his brother, who ends up drowning during the war experience. Jenkins is wounded 3 times, but returns back to service. And by February of 1865, Jenkins has had enough and deserts to the enemy and takes the oath. When he returns to North Carolina, because he had taken the oath, he is shunned by his family, and must have been sort of an incredible shock to him that all he had been through and suffered as much as he did, rejected by a family because of this. And so he enters the hospital in 1868 and never leaves, and dies here in 1891. So we see a number of these veterans begin to fill up the hospital. But again, in the Confederate Army, there are those who are mirror the compatriots on the Union side as far as the damage done to their minds, to their psyches, and who just cannot beat the war. As hard as they try, and many of them in the post-war years do have careers, and they go on to do things and fit back into post-war society, but that war always seems to find them. And this is an example with John G. Coltart, who was with Sherman Johnston's army and fights the Battle of Bentonville, and commander of Dee's brigade in that skirmish, but returns to Alabama, becomes a sheriff. But in only 3 short years after the war, he is committed to the asylum because of that war experience. And asylums all across the South begin to fill up with a lot of these soldiers. Now, this is an incredibly moving account that appears in the very first issue of Confederate Veteran magazine. And I can only imagine that the writer of this had just been haunted by this story that he had to express to readers and share this moment. And it's called Vivid War Experiences. And it talks about what happened as this young trooper walks away from the surrender at Greensboro in May of 1865. And it's just a heartbreaking story as he's walking along and he begins to see blood spatters in the road and all of these other soldiers who are just trudging away, lost in their own thoughts, trying to figure out what their world held for the next. And as he's walking down the road, he begins to see the scene ahead of them off to the side. And he sees a group of soldiers talking to a man who's sitting on a pile of railroad ties covered in this red and white paisley shirt. But as he gets closer, he begins to realize that this shirt doesn't have a pattern on it, but it's covered in blood. And as he walks up, he enters into this conversation, and here's this man who says, "Hey, take my coat. I don't need it anymore. Take it to my wife. She is the daughter of General Gabriel Rains." And as he's talking, the most amazing observation he makes that this fellow is putting his hand in his open shirt and pulling it out with blood and just wiping it on his arms. And he says that he feels that this wound is self-administered. So again, just an incredibly powerful vignette of what the surrender did to Confederates who had to deal with not only the trauma of 4 years of war, but what did defeat mean and the uncertainty of their new world. Their entire culture and communities are turned upside down. So that's an extra added pressure to the mental strain these guys faced. Now, for civilians, we see that they're overwhelmed with fear. And if you look back at Sherman, the entire purpose of his march across Georgia and to the Carolinas is to make civilians feel the hard hand of war. Not only to undercut their ability to wage war through supplies, to manufacturing, to rail transportation, but Sherman really wanted to attack the mind of the South. He believed if people were concerned about survival rather than supporting the war, it would bring the war to a shorter end. And so what loomed large in the minds of North Carolinians was what happened in Columbia, South Carolina in February of 1865. The inadvertent burning of the Capitol sent shockwaves across the country. And people here in Raleigh, which is the capital of North Carolina, really believed that this could happen to them. And many other towns across South Carolina suffered a similar fate. So why would Sherman spare what cities in North Carolina? And the refugees that sped away from Sherman's army brought the most horrific stories and tales of what they could experience of an encounter with Sherman's army. And there's just such a great deal of rumors and stories. It begins to deeply weigh on the minds of North Carolina civilians. So this specter of Sherman's army, the bummers especially, begins to gnaw away and begins to be another stress on top of what they had to experience of 4 years of their own war. 4 years of seeing and hearing about their brothers and fathers, cousins and sons being killed on the battlefield, and that stress. So with the approach of the armies, North Carolina civilians really begin to suffer a great deal of stress, almost it climaxes as they arrive here in central North Carolina. Now, this is Margaret Devereux. Her husband was the quartermaster general for North Carolina, so she was well connected here into Raleigh. And this is her plantation home called Will's Forest. And from her reminiscences after the war, she gives an incredible example of how this stress, especially on the minds of those who had to refugee from Sherman's army, how deeply it affected them. And she talks about the arrival of the Union Army in Raleigh. And as the Wills Forest was inundated with refugees, cousins of the Devereux who had fleeing Sherman's army. And these were mostly affluent, upper-class North Carolinians who were large plantation owners. But when they were forced to flee, they could only take what they could carry. So a lot of times they left their enslaved property, they left their homes, they left their fortunes. So this weighed deeply on the minds who had the most to lose. So as the Union Army approaches Raleigh on April 13th, 1865, many of the enslaved people on the Devereux plantation run in and announce the Yankees are coming. So as Margaret Devereux rushes upstairs at Will Forest to warn the other members of her family, she looks out the windows as she's passing the rooms and she sees her yard filling up with blue troopers. She dashes up the stair and bursts into the room where these cousins were getting ready for the day, but were unaware of what was happening. So as they dash to the window, they look out and they see an entire crowd of upturned, dirty Union soldiers' faces looking up. And there was even one soldier climbing up the side of the house. One of the women in the house who had been refugeeing and was assured that they were about to get ravaged due to all the stories she had heard and talked to all the people. And so she was terrified that they were about to be, just raped and ravaged and killed. So she turns to Margaret Devereux and says, "We can throw ourselves from the window." So she preferred suicide over what she felt was about to happen. And again, an instance that happened many other times for these Confederate families across North Carolina. Now, to deal with a lot of this stress, people handled it in different ways. Some had mental breakdowns, and then some tried to cope with the stress as best as possible. And this is Lucy Battle, and this is her house in Chapel Hill, which still stands today, called Senlac. And before the war, Lucy Battle was known as a woman who kept a firm grip on her house. When war came, 2 of her sons went off and died. So not only were Lucy Battle and her family having to struggle with shortages caused by the war, fear of slave rebellion with a lot of the men off and fighting in the army, the decline of the University of North Carolina that her family worked at, but the deaths of her 2 sons really pushed Lucy Battle over the edge, and I believe she developed a laudanum addiction. She begs her husband to write to their son in Raleigh. And her husband, William Battle, does that. And he says in his letter that your mother, she needs her medicine. And is she afraid that as Sherman approaches, she won't be able to get it? And you know how she acts when she doesn't get this medicine. So truly, Lucy Battle has developed some addiction to some medicines that will sort of dull the pain of this incredible emotional pain she's feeling. And not only during the war, but after the war, drug addiction becomes very popular. One could even say this is the first opiate addiction in American history, that not only do you see soldiers who are given these drugs on the battlefield and to create a dependency, but patent medicines and opiates become wildly overused after the war, just because of people trying to numb the emotional pain and deal with the trauma they suffered during the war. And again, one of the last examples of how this overwhelming wave of grief that was awashed over North Carolinians is easily seen in the story of Allen Wooten, a prominent Eastern North Carolina planter, legislator, who had supported the war effort, lost all of his plantation when the Union soldiers invaded Eastern North Carolina, and lost both of his sons, you see posted here. And with the arrival of Sherman's army in central North Carolina and the end of the war, Allen Wooten lost it. He fell apart. He was admitted to the North Carolina Insane Asylum on May 9th, became homicidal, didn't eat anything, and died a short time later on June 20th. So truly an extreme example of just how grief and stress breaks so many of these people. Now, it's interesting to think that African Americans at this time are suffer stress as well, but at the same time, they were relieved of a great deal of stress. As the war ends, both Union and Confederate armies marching to central North Carolina care little about African Americans. They do bring freedom to many of these people, which are overjoyed, but there is still a great deal of violence from Union soldiers and especially Confederate soldiers. As these people transition from being property to being a liability, Confederates take their time to basically to hurt these people, especially the ones who desire freedom are often executed by Confederates. Now, this is a page from the admissions to the North Carolina State Asylum for starting in late 1864 and going to January of 1865. So if you look at the very last entry, which takes place on April 18th, 1865, you'll see the admission of one Isaac, quotation marks, African. So this was the first Black patient to be admitted to the hospital. And he is only admitted when Union authorities force hospital administrators to admit this Black man for treatment. And if you look over in the other categories, you can see his age, if he's married, the numbers of attack, and the cause of why he's put into the hospital and how long he's been suffering from this. And it's incredibly interesting that he's been suffering from what many civilians will be put into the hospital, this strange catch-all diagnosis that many white patients suffered from, and it's simply the war you see written down there. And he's been suffering for the past month, so this would have been March of 1865. So we do see African Americans who are free to embrace emancipation are relieved of that great stress of slavery, but it is a very dangerous time for them as these armies are moving through. And as we'll start to see that trauma from slavery, for many generations of slavery, necessitates North Carolina building its own separate asylum for African Americans in 1887. So they have their own scars from the war and just in different ways. Now, one of the soldiers who traveled with Sherman, one of the few that Sherman picked up in Goldsboro, was this guy, Eli Hill, who was of the 37th United States Colored Troops, a former slave who had enlisted in Onslow County and traveled with Sherman along that long trek from Goldsboro on up to Raleigh and was here during the surrender. Now, it's interesting that Eli Hill comes back and is admitted to the asylum years after being here with the Army. And he's admitted in 1871 for what doctors called self-pollution. So is that related to his war service or not? You may never know. But again, it's one of the few African-American men and soldiers who took advantage of the mental health facilities here in Raleigh. Now, if you really want to see the extent of just how long the war haunted those who fought it, just peruse through the newspapers. And there are stories after stories, and many of them are grisly and very sad about how these men struggled with the war and just how many were put into asylums and how this war manifested itself in the rest of their lives. So as the mental health began to evolve and to try to take care of these men with the soldiers' homes and the asylums, they're filling up fast. So I don't think we've really understood the depth of how much this war affected those who fought it. By looking at the pension files of a lot of these soldiers, we really begin to mine incredible data about how many of these men were affected by their wounds. We can see long-term damage from their physical bodies from their service. And then we really get to see how many are affected mentally by these. And so it's just a great amount of data that we're still really only starting to realize how long and how deep and how powerful this war was in the lives of those who waged it. Again, in the South, we look at a lot of these soldiers' homes, and they become a rich amount of information to tell us as these men came to these homes and sought services provided by these, they become great. Many of them have a lot of problems keeping control of these old soldiers who develop drinking problems, who have opiate addictions, who are unsettled, they're uncontrollable. So there are even horror stories about the lives of these veterans in these soldiers' homes as they tried to care for these men who had deep mental issues. So the records are not as deep as they are for the Union Army, but the soldier homes do provide such a great insight into how this war haunted these men to the end of their days. So by looking at the end of the war in North Carolina, we get a real glimpse, just a real campaign level of how stress shows up, how it manifests itself, and how it kind of shaped how these men fought. And again, as we look about it, as America decided, as it moved away from the war and as the memory of the war changed, a lot of people look back at North Carolina and said, you know, that's part of a campaign that's in a moment that we don't want to remember. For the Union Army to talk about North Carolina had to talk about what they did to South Carolina, burning of Columbia, and the botched negotiations of Sherman and Johnston that had been in place that led to the Union government calling Sherman a traitor. That was not a real glamorous part of their war experience. And how do you explain to friends and family of making war and women and children as part of their making hard war on the South? And if you talk to Confederate veterans, that if they look back on the end of the war in North Carolina, that it was a low period. The army was falling apart. There were great desertions. We had to surrender. It was an awful time. So I think as America looked back on North Carolina, that it's just not enough there to celebrate and to honor. But the surrender at Appomattox is a nice, tidy bow. Grant and Lee shaking hands and ends the war on such a dramatic, noble note that we really don't think about how the rest of the war ended and how that way it was fought shaped that memory and what made them fight the way they were. And I wanted to end this on one of my favorite paintings from the war from Winslow Homer called The Veteran. And as we look at this veteran who is scything his field, is how the war stayed with these men and try to understand what the trauma that they experienced. And as we read larger Civil War histories, as we think about, keep this in mind as we read any other campaign about the mental, psychological, and physical effects the war had on them in the way they waged their war and how it stalked them for the rest of their lives. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much.